There's a springtime ring to have a friend right in your corner. Your heart will feel a little warmer. Tender loving care, tender loving care. Each warm and friendly touch lets someone know you care so much. Tender loving care, tender loving care.
Good evening, I'm Dr. Greenbrier Almond, and thank you for joining us on our program, Tender Loving Care. Each week for some 35 years, we've been talking about this interface between Christianity and medicine. And tonight, I'm really happy to be back from the Holy Land. My wife and I went on a pilgrimage, which is a chance in a lifetime, and we were able to do that with some 200 Christians from the United States. We joined Perry Stone, an evangelist, and actually, if you follow his ministry, he has a TV program. You may see us in the background listening to some sermons and some teachings that he gave while we were in Israel, in the Holy Land. I think maybe more than 10 programs were recorded, so you may pick those up in the future if you're interested in his TV ministry. But certainly, his tour is one of the best out there, and I would recommend Perry Stone always the third week of November each year. He's been doing this for some 28 years, and of course, as a West Virginian, he has some pull here in West Virginia. You have a number of people that you could be familiar with, traveling with, and it's a great tour. Let me share with you some of the things that I've discovered about my faith walk while I've been overseas. And I've been writing stories. I'm not going to read these stories to you, but you know the custom that has developed since my father had his book, Stories of a West Virginia Doctor. Then I've had 3 more books, and it's fun to do this, to record what's happening in a sense with little bits of life with some lessons included. And I was able to do that while we were traveling in Israel. The first 4 days that we arrived, we spent around Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, and then we were around Jerusalem for 4 days. A ninth day, we went on over to Mount Nebo, where Moses stood. This is across the Jordan, the land of the Edomites and Moabites and cousins, if you will, to the Jewish people. And part of some of them, of course, part of the original tribes and part of the Promised Land. But anyway, we were up on Mount Nebo, and then another day we went over to the ancient city of Petra, which has been buried in the sand for some 500 years. It's just been discovered in the last 100 years or so, and was the subject of a Raiders of the Lost Ark film. And since that came out, the Temple of Doom, there have been thousands of people coming every day to that site, and so we traveled there too. Let me talk a little bit about the Sea of Galilee first of all, because this is where Jesus spent most of his time. He grew up in Nazareth. We found out geographically that Nazareth is about 30 miles from the lake. So that'd be like saying we're about 30 miles here in Buchanan from Stonewall Jackson Lake. And but Jesus lived up on a high plateau, grew up in Nazareth, and then when he had his ministry, he came down a Roman road down to the Sea of Galilee, and more population, more people, and spent most of his time around Capernaum, which is a lovely little fishing village at one end of the Sea of Galilee. They call it a brook. The River Jordan is not very big. It's smaller than the Buchanan River, and it flows through Capernaum and out into the lake, Sea of Galilee. And that fresh water has a lot of oxygen in it. It's the rapids, are flowing off of Herman, and a lot of rapids, a lot of waterfall, and so the fish thrive in that environment. And this is and it's all subtropical. So that would be another thing I didn't know. As a Christian, I supposed it was like our climate, and so while they do have the sycamore tree, Zacchaeus climbed up in a sycamore tree, and they do have a lot of other trees that we find in common. They also have the date palm, and actually, when we say that a land is flowing with milk and honey, we're talking about goat's milk, not cow's milk, and we're talking about date honey, not regular honey. So that expression, the land flowing with milk and honey, has a lot to do with for example, the subtropical climate, the date palm, and of course, you see a lot of trees planted by the Israelis. When they came back as a nation in 1948 to establish the modern nation of Israel, it had all been deforested and it was pretty barren. And so they promptly planted some 240 million trees. So they have a wide variety of forests that are growing at this time, some 66 years ago as a nation. So, but let me share a little bit about what I saw about Jesus' ministry. We walked where Jesus walked. That was one of the wonderful things to do, because you know the Bible stories, but then you wonder how it was all laid out. Well, Jesus spent most of his time around the Sea of Galilee. His disciples were in part fishermen and local people. He would have probably been a fairly robust man. He was a carpenter by trade, we understand, because he followed his father's pattern. That would be the common way we look at that. And so you can see things that he would have had to make, which would be physical things. Working with olive wood is hard as possible, and they have beautiful olive wood things, but it takes a lot of energy to do that. And by the way, the olive trees are huge. They've let them grow. Some have grown 1,000 years, maybe 2,000 years. Some parts of the country which I didn't see, but where it's more tropical, maybe the olive trees are even 5,000 years old. But the ones we saw, particularly in the Garden of Gethsemane, where they've been preserved from the beginning of time, these would be 12 or 15 feet across. So here we are sitting in a room, a living room in our home that's probably 15 or 20 feet across, and the tree itself would be as big as this room. So they're quite impressive, the olive trees are. And Jesus, for example, as he taught common examples. When you say something is out of a shoot off the root of Jesse, it's an analogy to the root of how an olive grows. As the tree gets old, it dies back, but the roots are still good, and a new shoot will come up from the roots to form a new tree. And so that would be a easily understood expression, a shoot off of the roots of Jesse, and that would describe David, and it would describe Jesus, his lineage. Another thing, and this surprised me as a doctor, I was very interested in his healings, and so we went to learn about the miracles of Jesus and where they were performed, and maybe some of why things happened the way they did. One of the things that surprised me is that the walls of the houses are very thick. So there's a story about a crowd. Jesus is teaching in Capernaum and probably in Peter's house, and he is he's healing people, and so this friends of this paralyzed man want Jesus to heal their friend, and they press through the crowd. They try to get close to Jesus. It's very hard to do. They finally get to the house, and they can see the walls are thick and the windows, they can't get in the windows. So anyway, they go up on the roof, and the roof are tile roofs, easy just to lift them up, and then they let the paralyzed man down into the room where Jesus is teaching and healing. And of course, so someone dropping into a room would take precedence over anyone else. And so Jesus says to the man, your sins are forgiven, and then, take up your pallet and walk. And the man does both those things. He feels his sins are forgiven, and he walks. And so Jesus heals the man. But you can see the layout of the house. You can see how that would have happened. That it would have been wise and easy for the friends to get up on a roof and maybe go building to building, and then let the paralyzed man down into the room where Jesus is teaching. The other thing I learned, and there's no microphones, there's no recordings of Jesus' voice, there's nothing like that, but you'd wonder how he could talk to 5,000 people. And I didn't realize, but when you are in a boat, because in one scene, the fisherman, Jesus sits in a fishing boat and he has it put out to sea a little bit, and he teaches to people sitting on the shore. Well, when you're on a lake, on a shore, your voice projects wonderfully, and so it acts like a microphone. So it's very fortuitous that Jesus would be teaching from a boat, because his voice could project to 5,000 people. In other words, you hear the Bible story, we know the Bible story, we can go to the Bible and read those, but when you go to the Holy Land, you can actually point to where this event happened. You can see what's happening, you can see how it's possible to understand what's happening. The Mount of Beatitudes, Jesus went up on a mountain, gave the Sermon on the Mountain, and the famous, from the 5th chapter to the 7th chapter of Matthew, he talks about the Beatitudes and many other things he teaches there. We went up on the mountain, which is above Capernaum, up toward Nazareth, and it's a very prominent hill, and he had, it was an ideal site for teaching. Interesting enough, that particular day it rained, and around the Sea of Galilee they do have a fair amount of rain. We're talking about 13 inches a year, but it's not a desert like 2 inches a year, as you see in Jordan, across the Jordan River. It can be very dry, not too far away from the Sea of Galilee. But on the particular day that we arrived, and for 2 days while we were there, it rained heavily. And in fact, one of the days it was announced that they were having more rain on that particular day than they had had in Israel in 60 years on any particular day. So maybe an inch or two of rain in one day. And that was okay for us because we all had our umbrellas, we were prepared, and it didn't bother us. In fact, growing up in what we call Sunny Buck here in Buchanan, I actually had always thought that if it's not raining or not about to rain, that it's abnormal. And I appreciate that we get a lot of rain here, 60, 80 inches a year sometimes. But we were there for at least a couple rainy days. And when you're up on the mountain where the Sermon on the Mount is taught, and it rains, the flowers all come out and bloom. And so you can even understand how Jesus could look out across the field and say that the lilies of the field are more richly arrayed than even Solomon in all his glory, and that God provides for all our needs. You can see it from the common geographic descriptions. Another thing I discovered, and I didn't really try to understand how big Israel is. It's not very big. It would be no bigger than central West Virginia. I mean, you certainly couldn't go from, say, southern Upshur County to the northern part of say, Harrison County toward Marion County. That might be the whole nation. It may be at best, if you go clear down to the bay where it shares the Bay of Aqaba. It might be 150 miles long, but there's a lot of the Dead Sea and area there that are not where people just don't live. And by the way, the extremes in the geography are you see them in other ways. Mount Herndon, which is above the Sea of Galilee, is 9,000 feet tall. The Sea of Galilee is 700 feet below sea level. And then if you go down to the Dead Sea, because the Sea of the Jordan River flows out of the Sea of Galilee and down to the Dead Sea, you're now 1,300 feet below sea level, and that's quite startling. It's the lowest point on land on earth, the nation of Israel, and particularly the Dead Sea. But we went on up Mount Herndon, and as a mountaineer, I'd like to go up and see that. They have deer, and I was over there during deer season here in West Virginia, so I was glad to see deer. And and we were driving in a bus as we went up the mountain. It's 7,000 feet tall, so it's really much taller than any mountain in West Virginia. And it's an extinct volcano from a long time ago. But you can see the waterfall. You see you understand how a deer would be panting after the water, as David said, he pants after God and His love. You can see the how these things are. There was a place called Philippi Caesarea where the Romans worshipped, and they had many gods. They were not like the Israelites where there was only one God, and the Greeks had even come there before and they'd worshipped. And what we saw there was a series of rapids and waterfalls and caves, and and often in those caves, and some of those would be the tombs. We went incidentally no one actually knows where Jesus lay, what garden it was that the rich Pharisee Sanhedrin, who asked for the body of Jesus and to lay in his tomb, and Jesus was in a tomb, until Easter, until he rose from the dead. Several days he was in the tomb, but we went to an empty tomb in a garden, and we saw how that could have been. We weren't sure that we were exactly historically where the tomb is, but that's okay. Christ is risen. He's not in a tomb anyway. But we can see how these tombs are carved out of the mountains or out of a hill, or maybe it's a volcanic bubble where there would be an opening into a very black rock, and you could see that they would use that as a tomb, and they could roll a stone against that to seal it. We were in such a garden in Jerusalem, and we also saw Golgotha, the area of the skull, and it's the shape of a skull. You see the eye sockets and the nose and the mouth, a rock formation looking like that, and that would be could be the place where Jesus was crucified. What we do know, and again you can see in Jerusalem, the walled city, the old walled city, the new city of Jerusalem is huge, 2.5 million people probably. Well, more than that, probably 3 or 4 million people. And Tel Aviv is a big city, but the old city, where the city of the Bible time, is on a very tall mountain, and it had high walls around it. And we know that Jesus was crucified outside the city walls. And he was probably on a main Roman highway, so you can generally pinpoint where it is. I was talking to Dr. Bob Chamberlain today as I got back from Israel, and he was out walking, I was out walking, and he had gone to Israel several years ago. He asked me what was my most impressive point, what did I like most of the sites that I saw. And I would say Mount Nebo, where Moses stood, because we have a farm out at Mount Nebo, and when I was beginning to come up with a farm name, we wanted to call it the Promised Land, because there's a Methodist church out at Mount Nebo between here and Elkins, and when you stand up on that high point where the church is located in the graveyard, you can look down across the fields into a valley, and the trees are there, and that's where our farm is. And the Promised Land is where Moses stood. And because Moses had disobeyed God, God was going to provide water for the Israelites, 2 million people in a desert, an amazing miracle in itself. But God said, just talk to the rock, and the water will come sprouting out of it. Well, Moses struck the rock twice and God considered that a disobedience, and so He said, in the end, that you've led the people for 40 years, you've done a good job. He was pleased with him, obviously, and Moses and God had a relationship that no one else outside of Christ, Elijah, a few other people may have had in history. He was not allowed to go into the Promised Land, but he was allowed to go up on Mount Nebo, which is a very, very high mountain, and the term Pisgah, which is also in the Bible, it means peak. He went to the very peak of the mountain, and when you stand there, as I stood, you can go look down into the Jordan Valley. You can see Jericho across the valley on the Israel side. You can see 30 miles distance to where Jerusalem is, and then you can, on a clear day, you can see over Jerusalem. You can see to the Mediterranean Sea. If you stretch your imagination a little bit, you can see Gaza, where they fought this summer. So it's all very tiny altogether. But I was impressed, and I enjoyed going to Mount Nebo because I could see a parallel to where we live here. Bob Chamberlain said he liked the Garden of Gethsemane, and I could see why that could be a favorite of someone who goes to Israel. The Garden of Gethsemane is in the Kidron Valley. The Kidron Valley, there's many hills. West Virginian will feel comfortable, but Jerusalem's on one hill, the Mount of Olives is on one hill, and there's a valley in between, and it's called the Kidron Valley. And in the valley, that's where the olive orchard is planted, and the Garden of Gethsemane is located there in the valley. And so you see what happened. Jesus could come in from Jericho, and he would come up one hill to Bethany. He would be escorted on Palm Sunday down a road that would run down to Gethsemane, and then there would be another road up into the western gate. There were 4 gates, south, north, east, west, and so the western gate would be right near the Garden of Gethsemane. What I liked about the Garden of Gethsemane, and we certainly had a chance to spend time there meditating, and Jesus prayed there. It's a very, very powerful place in the Bible. You get a feeling that it's an undisturbed site. Many of these other sites, are surrounded by more modern buildings and things of that nature. Sometimes churches have been built on top of them. But the Garden of Gethsemane is probably pretty much as Jesus would have found it, with trails to walk through and around the big olive trees. And the term Gethsemane just means to have a olive press. So it would just be a place where you would grow olives, and you would press them to get the oil out. What I didn't realize, and this is a symbolic thing, but the Jewish people will, when they press an olive or whatever fruit they're picking, they'll give the first fruits to God. So they would give that to the temple, and it'd be an offering. And so when you press an olive, the first juice that comes out will be the best juice of the olive, and that is given as an offering. Then the middle portion, as you press it, you put the olives in a burlap bag, and you bring the press down like you make cider here in West Virginia, and that would be the household olive oil, the virgin olive oil that you would use for salads and cooking and so forth. And then finally, you try to get everything out. You press very hard in the end, and you get some industrial strength olive oil, if you want to say it that way. And that could be used in lamps for burning. So they used everything about the olive oil. But there's Jesus as an offering, as a sacrifice for all of our sins, and he was the first fruit. And he was praying hard in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was praying so much that it said that he was sweating blood, and very intense. And he was asking if this cup can be taken from me, but nevertheless, thy will. He's praying to God. in terms like that. Because you can imagine, Israel's a wonderful nation. He's a 33-year-old man. It was quite a sacrifice for him not to live out his life in a way that he could see people around him living. But he knew why he was here. He knew his purpose. And when you go to Israel, you see the way Jesus, you see through Jesus' eyes. Another place, and I would could go on and on here, and maybe other programs will talk about it, but surely it's important to see where the Last Supper was served, because that's where in the Passion Week when Jesus washed the feet and he offered up communion, which is those are ceremonies of the church, and he said, "Remember me whenever you do these things," and so he offered up a cup, the grape juice, and it was speculated, and I believe this would be true. It's certainly true in my denomination. We use grape juice rather than wine because we don't want to be an impediment to anyone who may have a problem with alcohol. But even in Jesus' time, it was probably not fermented because, again, the first fruits would be what they were toasting with that night at the Passover, and that would be fresh grape juice. But then the bread was broken and so forth. But we went to the upper room, and it's in the Old Jerusalem section within the walled city, and we climbed up steps. We went into a room, and you could see how it would be laid out. Interesting enough, it's not as portrayed in Da Vinci's drawing or artwork, but it would be a U-shaped table, and so Jesus would be at the head, and probably the disciple that he loved would be beside him, and then Judas would have been beside him on the other side, according to the order of the meal. Things that I would not have known, but I appreciated getting to know. Well, all this to wet your whistle. If you're watching this tonight and you are preparing for Christmas, then you should also say to yourself, Lord willing, if I could get to Israel, it would be a wonderful pilgrimage. There are a number of tours that we had options to take, offered from West Virginia and from national ministries, and I would recommend to anyone the Perry Stone trip. Until the next time then, this is Dr. Greenbrier Allman thanking you for joining us on our program, Tender Loving Care. Special thanks to Channel 3 for this opportunity to come your way each week. We'll continue to talk about some of the Holy Land experiences, and then of course we're going to have some guests as we get into Christmas season. So God bless you, and I'm looking forward to a Merry Christmas.
Stories of a West Virginia Doctor, written by Dr. Harold D. Allman. A collection of 55 short stories about his experience as a small-town doctor in central West Virginia. And Tender Loving Care. Stories from a West Virginia Doctor, Volume 2, written by Dr. Greenbrier Allman, using videotapes to write 70 additional stories of his father's very colorful life as a small-town doctor. They can be found for purchase at Amazon.com and most local bookstores. Tune into Channel 3 Buckhannon for Tender Loving Care with Dr. Greenbrier Allman, where he talks about the connection between Christianity and medicine.